on our channel, we often try and talk about really difficult subjects, and it seems that the subject of race in America is just about as difficult as it gets. You've written quite a few pieces for Quillette, and you've also been on the Sam Harris podcast, you've been on Dave Rubin. The pieces that you've written have taken what you might call a kind of heterodox approach to the issue of race in America. How would you summarize that perspective?
Well, first thing I would say is I think the word heterodox is overused because by definition, a single take can't be heterodox. I guess it's heterodox relative to what one generally hears about race. If you read mainstream media, if you read the New York Times, if you purchase books on the bestsellers list, if you watch CNN, you'll generally get the sense that what it means to be a person who is seriously grappling with the issue of race in 2019 is to understand that what we should be doing now is trying to correct for the power imbalance that has historically characterized America. What that means is we should be open to and very encouraging of race-conscious policies, affirmative action, reparations, rather than policies based on socioeconomics, which in my view provide a better signal of actual privation. What you're supposed to think nowadays is that we haven't seriously grappled with the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, lynching. And what it means to grapple with these things is often left unclear. But it means that you're supposed to read Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, The Case for Reparations, and nod along and signal in ways, signal with the way you talk about race that you're not one of those white people. You're not one of the deplorables. You're in the know. You're woke. If you're black, the way one is supposed to talk about race is to emphasize whatever uncomfortable experiences one has had in virtue of one's race. Because many or most black people can point to something in their past, some situation that would have gone more favorably had they not been black. So the idea is to zoom in on that, make that seem representative of what it's like to be black in America. Signal that you know concepts like systemic racism. Racism is not merely the KKK guy in the hood burning crosses on lawns. It's subtle, it's systemic. It pervades the healthcare system, the education system, criminal justice system. These are the things that you're supposed to believe, and you're supposed to signal that you believe them affirmatively, lest you be considered racist or naive. The concept of colorblindness, the rhetoric of Martin Luther King these days is generally a no-no. Basically the quickest way to signal that you don't know what you're talking about on race is to say, well, didn't Martin Luther King say, and then just quote Martin Luther King saying something that you actually can't say nowadays. So the lines I've taken on race have tended to be critical of the concept of systemic racism, critical of what I would call the anti-racist consensus that we ought to be discussing the ways in which race is meaningful. Words like blackness and whiteness, the idea that these are substantive concepts, that people should see an important aspect of their identity as being race. So I tend to push back against these notions and emphasize what you might call a more humanist or colorblind perspective, in the sense that ascribing meaning to your skin is a kind of logical error. And it's a shame that we've lost sight of the fact that we are all human beings, and that the project should generally be to use policy and conversation to make as many people flourish as can possibly flourish, regardless of the way they look and the census category they fit in.
Do you accept the idea of systemic racism?
I think systemic racism, ever since the concept was born in the book Black Power in 1967, has always been confusing, because it was originally called institutional racism, and it was created in contrast to what was called individual racism. So the idea was you have individual racists; these are people who have bias in their minds or hearts, and you have racist policies, like Jim Crow policies in the South. But then we have this other thing that's much more subtle. It's called systemic racism, and it's not located in the individuals or the policies, but in the quote-unquote system. And even if you read the first articulation of the concept, it's clear that there's some confusion behind it. Because if it's not in the individuals and it's not in the policies, it's not clear that there really is a third place for the racism to be located. So I would argue that there's a conceptual problem with systemic racism to begin with. And aside from the conceptual problem, there's an empirical problem. There are several empirical problems. One is that generally the studies used to justify the notion that the US has a systemic racism problem are taking big categories like blacks and whites, comparing them on some mean statistic, finding some difference, and then ascribing that to systemic racism. One problem with that is blacks and whites are different groups with different histories, different demographics, different average ages, and when you control for that, some of that stuff will go away. The second problem is that even when you can control for everything that's measurable, there are all kinds of huge and important immeasurable differences between people. So even if you think you're comparing like with like, so we're just going to look at 25-year-old black men and 25-year-old white men, both from two-parent households who live in Wisconsin. And why is it the case that black men are incarcerated I'm just making this up, but at X times the rate of the white men? Isn't that systemic racism? Well, no, not necessarily, because there are all kinds of relevant differences that can't be measured with numbers, like culture, habits, customs, values, desires. And we should notice that we're not tempted to do this in many areas. We're not tempted to look at the fact that 20% of postal workers are black, or 3/4 of the NBA is black, and jump to the conclusion that there's a systemic bias towards black people in those cases. So what I would say is people are far, in addition to there being a conceptual problem, there's just a huge literature that's founded on the presumption that in the absence of bias, groups would achieve identical outcomes, and there's no reason to support that assumption. That said, individual racism is certainly real, and I don't ever expect it to go away. And the other caveat I would give is that there are certain rare instances where I think the notion of systemic racism is useful. For example, there was a study recently that showed court stenographers routinely messed up in transcribing the speech of black defendants and of black people testifying in court. And black stenographers and white stenographers were both equally likely to mess up. So this is a notion where it's not that these people were individually biased against black people. It was just hearing African American vernacular, they were worse at transcribing it in a way that redounded to the detriment of black people disproportionately. So there, it's not a policy, it's not quite an individual anti-black bias. So in those rare instances, I do think the notion of systemic racism is justified. But what's interesting is not how many such examples there are, but how few.
I mean, race is certainly one of the most polarizing topics and one of the hottest topics in American culture. Do you feel an obligation to use your words extremely carefully?
Yes, I do, because I want to get my point across without being needlessly inflammatory. I don't enjoy making people angry. I'm actually a rather conflict-averse person by nature, which I know people won't believe, but it's true. So I try not to inflame any more than I need to make a point. Because what I've learned is when I say things that seem totally commonsensical and rational to me, sometimes that causes a shitstorm, at least in my Twitter bubble, which admittedly is a very, very small corner of the world that in the grand scheme of things doesn't matter all that much. But yeah, I do feel a responsibility to be careful with, there are many different ways to make the same point. You can make it with a variety of formulations that range from pointed and clickbaity to overly academic and hidden behind jargon. And it's certainly more art than a science to find where in that spectrum you fit. But I do my best.
And what's the reaction been to the articles, mostly online?
I get everything from scholarly critiques of niche points that I've made to complete dismissals of me as a human being, as a sellout, and as an Uncle Tom who just wants to make white people feel good so that I can collect paychecks. And I get everything in between. And I tune most of the stuff on that end of the spectrum out because it's boring. And I get some legitimate critiques and a lot of praise as well. So I get the full spectrum.
One of the issues about the work that you're doing is that it would be very difficult. Like, we seem to be in a bit of a catch-22 situation at the moment where it would be very difficult for a white author to be making some of the points that you're making.
People are more liable to give me the benefit of the doubt because I happen to be black. They assume that A, I understand racism exists, and that B, I'm coming from a good place in terms of my internal intentions. And those two assumptions generally don't extend to white people who make the same points that I do. And that doesn't make sense to my brain, but I suppose there's a kind of logic to it. It's a kind of heuristic stereotyping logic, which goes, there are some legitimate racists. We do polls and we still find sometimes 5 or 10% of white people in this country agreeing with just outright racist claims. So when you hear a white person criticizing affirmative action, that could be a white supremacist, or it could be a political centrist or even a liberal who just has a particular perspective. And if you're trying to determine on a small amount of information which is which, you might just form a heuristic to say, assume they're all white supremacists if they're making noises that a white supremacist might make. And there's a kind of logic to that, and there's a kind of logic to treating whites and blacks differently there, but because a black person is very unlikely to be a white supremacist, so you're kind of forming a stereotype and a heuristic to play the odds. Of course, to some degree, people are doing this all the time. Everyone is stereotyping subtly all the time. But we know that we're not actually supposed to act on stereotypes. We're supposed to treat people as individuals. And we have taboos on stereotyping for a reason. It's only that those taboos become inactive when we're now discussing a white person who you're stereotyping as a racist because they have a nuanced grasp of affirmative action, or they don't think that they're concerned about racial crime disparities or what have you. So I think the strategy that should be employed there is to treat people as individuals regardless of what is true statistically of people who hold their view.
And you mentioned this before, that some of the criticism has been that you're making white people feel better, or and if we were to take a sort of more critical view, you've certainly had a very fast rise in terms of your success with the Quillette pieces and being invited onto Sam Harris and onto Dave Rubin. So a cynic might say you're being taken up by people who are just wanting to make white people feel better about the legacy of slavery, for example.
What I would say to that is it starts the story in the middle, because ever since the late 60s, there has been a powerful and loud group of intellectuals, writers, orators, who have been intentionally making white people feel guilty, keeping white people feeling as if they're on the hook for crimes that they did not commit, which on its face is a bizarre thing to do to a person, or a bizarre thing to suggest is rational, that you should feel shame for crimes that you had nothing to do with. What they would argue is that you benefit from it. America was built on the back of slavery, so how can you possibly exempt yourself from that legacy? And it's people who looked like you who perpetrated these. It was your ancestors, regardless of whether it actually was. The point is you benefit from it. So to start the story in the middle and say, well, Coleman, you're making white people feel less guilty for slavery and Jim Crow. Well, it's like, yeah, because they shouldn't have felt guilty for those things in the first place. I don't think guilt is a useful emotion or shame when you're talking about how to craft policy to make the majority of Americans flourish as much as possible. It's not clear to me why guilt is a useful emotion to throw into that discussion, because guilt is too powerful. Guilt is an extremely powerful emotion. It has not a unique power, but it's capable of shutting down reason to a degree that is really remarkable. And I don't mind if my writing makes white people feel less white guilt, because the whole idea of race pride and race guilt is corrupt to begin with. So I would agree with does my writing make people feel less guilty? Sure, that's fine. That's not my intention. My intention is just to make sense about race in America and to critique the way we talk about race and put forward alternative frameworks that are more useful. But if part of that entails people feeling less guilt, shame, or pride for the amount of melanin in their skin, then so much the better.
I'd say one of the sort of summarizing for maybe people who haven't read many of your pieces, one of the themes that you talk about a lot is that if you just look at kind of disparities between different racial groups and conclude that it's only due to discrimination, you're ignoring a whole load of other factors that could be responsible for that. Would that be a good summary? And in particular in that the role of culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a lot of the confusion around systemic racism stems from the assumption that in the absence of some systemic bias, different groups would achieve statistically equal outcomes. We have no reason to believe that this is true if you think about it for just a few minutes. For example, the average white American household of Russian descent earns $1 for every 79 cents earned by the average white American household of French descent. In America, both of these groups would just be called white people. But if you categorize them by the country in Europe they came from, you get a 21 cent on the dollar pay gap. Does that imply that the US is systemically racist against white American French people? Well, no. It's just that these disparities are the norm. It's normal to have disparities between groups with entirely different histories, entirely different patterns of migration, entirely different demographics, entirely different average ages. And this is equally true if you break down quote-unquote black people into subgroups and sub-ethnicities. You'll find that Nigerian households make not only more than the average American household, but much more than the average, say, Haitian American household. Yet both of these people are black. If we can't even attain parity within races, what is the thinking that assumes we should be achieving parity between races when races have entirely different histories and patterns of migration and cultures and values at the median? This is a completely unsupported assumption, and yet it is rarely challenged, because if you do challenge it, then you have to be willing to cite uncomfortable facts about different cultures having different values that lead them at the median to achieve different outcomes, whether it's in education, athletics, or business.
The example that you just gave was Haitian and Nigerian, I think. And obviously the big issue under all of this is the legacy of slavery, which I guess the Haitian would have and the Nigerian wouldn't. So
not necessarily. I mean, there's been slavery in modern day Nigeria. There's been slavery virtually everywhere there's been civilization. Obviously, we know more about the transatlantic slave trade, partially because the West participated in it. Most people don't know that 14 million Africans were enslaved by Arabs. Most people know very little about the history of slavery in China. Most people know very little about the history of white slaves on the Barbary Coast in North Africa. So one thing I would say is, yes, we have a recent legacy of slavery in the West Indies, in America, in Brazil, etc. And we happen to know more about it because we're kind of narcissistic about our own history, and we talk about slavery as if it's something only America and Britain and Portugal participated in. But slavery is as old as civilization. It's at least 10,000 years old. It's been practiced on every continent that's been inhabited, in virtually every civilization. So in some sense, the legacy of slavery is something everyone in the world is trailing, not just Black Americans.
What do you think are the best criticisms of your pieces that you've seen?
That's a tough question, because if the criticisms are that good, then they become my new opinions. So they don't stay criticisms for long if they're that good, I think.
So I guess another way of asking that question is, how have your views changed then?
I mean, in too many ways to count, too many small ways that probably don't get flagged in the moment the changes are happening. I think one thing I've probably changed my mind on recently is the degree to which the welfare state is responsible for the rise of the single-parent family in the Black community. I think that those claims are less supported than they're sometimes trumped up to be, especially by conservative intellectuals. There's no doubt that there was a huge spike in single-parent homes, but it started a little bit before the welfare state, or before the huge Great Society era expansion. So that's one reason to doubt that the welfare state was the primary cause. And secondly, I've been looking at the work of the economist Rick Nevin on lead poisoning, and the degree to which lead poisoning is correlated with the rise and fall of violent crime in America and throughout the world, the rise and fall of out-of-wedlock births. So it's led me to greatly upregulate my belief about how important lead poisoning and environmental toxins have been relative to liberal policy in the breakdown of the Black family.
So there's a big conversation going on around reparations at the moment. I think Ta-Nehisi Coates had a big piece in The Atlantic about it. Brett Weinstein talks about he's not a fan of reparations, but he does believe that some kind of investment into black neighborhoods to make up for histories of disadvantage should be considered. Do you agree with either of those perspectives?
The question presumes that we haven't already done that. This thing happened called the Civil Rights Revolution. We had the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, Community Reinvestment Act. We've had set-aside programs for decades that specifically target minority business owners for lucrative government contracts. We have diversity and inclusion programs that redound to the benefit of people of color in virtually every sector of the labor market. The idea that we haven't yet targeted black people with race-conscious policy meant to uplift Black America, and that we're now considering whether to start, is absolutely ludicrous. We have an entire networks and bureaucracies that are self-sustaining, that seek to that were created in essence to pay black people back for slavery and Jim Crow. So it's not a question of whether to start doing race-conscious policy. We've had that for decades. Part of the reason I think that it gets framed that way is because we haven't seen as much progress in reducing disparities as people expected to. So what happens is you implement some great new race-conscious program that's going to uplift black people. 20 years later, you see that the black-white gap in whatever relevant area has remained the same. And then after the fact, you say, well, we haven't really done anything. And it's like, wait, no, you're just saying that now because the policy you proposed actually didn't work. So one thing I would say is, again, disparities are normal. It's actually like no one is losing any sleep over the 21-cent household income gap between French Americans and Russian Americans. We're only losing sleep over similar types of disparities between blacks and whites. And we should interrogate why it is that we're losing sleep over the one and not the other. Really why. And don't just say slavery and Jim Crow. Go deeper than that. Because I'm sure you could tell a historical story about why the French and the Russians aren't at perfect parity. And B, we need a conceptual change in the way we understand what progress entails. Does progress entail equal outcomes? Well, not really. And this may seem a glib point, but you could easily get equal outcomes just by making the people who are doing better do worse. Like, take some income away from Asian Americans so that they're earning as much as white Americans, and you've made progress. And then take income away from both so that blacks, whites, and Asians are all making the same amount of income. And now we've achieved parity. Isn't the world better? Well, no, you've just made a lot of people poorer. That's it. So the way we should conceptualize progress should allow for different groups that have some disparity, say blacks and whites, to both make progress without the disparity necessarily having to collapse, because disparities don't always collapse, right? And that's not an indictment of society when they don't.
And I mean, you kind of hinted at the idea of unintended consequences there. And you had a really interesting example of that in the Sam Harris podcast, I think, in affirmative action and what happened in California. Mm-hmm. Can you outline that?
Well, yeah, this is what's been called the mismatch theory or the mismatch effect, which is when you take an 18-year-old black high school graduate and you apply affirmative action to their application, which is to say you put them in a much more competitive school than they otherwise would have gotten into at their level of preparedness. What you're doing, in effect, is putting them in the bottom 10% of preparedness at a top school, where they might have been at the 50th percentile if they were a white applicant at a different school. So there's, I believe his name is Richard Sander, is the UCLA law professor who wrote the book on this. But basically what happens are a few things. you're more likely to drop out because you're struggling in every class. And it's not for lack of intelligence, it's just for a mismatch between your level of preparedness and the school, specifically the student pool that you're part of. You're more likely to switch to less rigorous majors. So I believe there was a study at Duke University that showed the amount of black kids who came into Duke wanting to study rigorous majors like economics, but then defecting to far less rigorous majors like African American studies. And then if you look at the amount of whites that came in wanting to do economics, far fewer dropped out into less rigorous majors. So that's an adverse consequence that doesn't get talked about much, but is concerning and certainly is a side effect of affirmative action, which is supposedly this policy that is so important for uplifting black people, and if it were gutted, we would just be sending America back to the 1950s, and yet has shown remarkably little progress in the 50 some odd years that it's been around.
But what I understood is that they abolished it in California and then they saw the grades rise or more success.
That's right. Yeah, they abolished it in either 1994 or 1996. And there were doomsayers who said this is going to set black people back. It actually didn't. It narrowed the test score gap at many UC schools. UC San Diego, I think, the GPA gap between blacks and whites virtually disappeared, which makes sense. Which makes sense because now the students admitted to UC San Diego in a colorblind fashion were on par with the 50th percentile student that goes there, rather than being rather than getting someone who would do pretty well at a somewhat lesser school and shuttling them into that more competitive environment where they're being set up for failure.
And what do you think are the most compelling comparisons or examples to make to illustrate the points that you're trying to make?
Yeah, so there are several examples throughout history of groups of people that experienced enormous levels of oppression, and not only did they nevertheless achieve at what would be seen as a high level of success, but at a higher level of success than the groups that oppressed them. So one example I often use are Japanese Americans who came to this country in the first wave of Japanese immigration as illiterate peasants in the early 20th century. There were laws on the books in 13 or 14 states called the Alien Land Laws that prevented them from owning property until 1952, when those laws were ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. By 1960, Japanese people had a higher rate of college attainment than white people, than white Americans. So, I mean, that's one example. I could also give the example of West Indian and African immigrants in the United States who, there haven't been many studies on this, but from Douglas Massey's study and from Lonnie Guinier and Henry Louis Gates' study in the early 2000s, we know anywhere from 40% to 2/3 of the black students at Ivy League colleges are West Indian immigrants, African immigrants, or their children. That cohort only makes up 10% of the US black population, so they're massively overrepresented at the highest levels of achievement. And yet, certainly in the case of West Indians, this is a group that was formerly enslaved. So what happens, the reason I could say similar things about Jewish Americans as well. The reason I bring these examples up is to combat the lazy assumption that sees a group lagging today behind the majority ethnic group, sees that group has also been oppressed throughout history, and assumes that the oppression is the main cause of the lagging. You can make the point in the opposite direction as well. There are groups that do lag behind without having necessarily a historical reason to lag behind. So there's a point where Puerto Ricans in New York City had lower incomes than blacks in New York City, despite having been a recent wave of voluntary immigration. They didn't have the history of slavery in the US to point to as a reason. They came here voluntarily, unlike black people, and yet showed similar patterns of single-parent homes, crime. You could say much the same about the Irish when they first came, the Italians when they first came. They sometimes had murder rates that were 5 times the rate of, say, German Americans. And they didn't necessarily have the history of oppression to blame it on. So I'm trying to, the common thread here is that there's a lazy assumption of causation where it may not be the case.
Why do you think this subject is so important?
Well, we have to be able to think clearly about the sources of socioeconomic disparity, to conceptualize the problem. We have to have the right concepts to apply to the problem, because if we're thinking about the whole thing upside down, then inevitably our solutions are going to be upside down as well. So that's, reparations is now seriously on the table in a condition of limited funding for any given policy. Serious people are considering giving some of that money or some of that policy or some of those resources to someone like me whose ancestors were slaves in this country, rather than my white friend whose parents were meth addicts. That's a serious idea. I mean, like, people are at minimum paying lip service to that, and at most endorsing it. And that stems directly from a misunderstanding of the sources of racial disparity and the presumptions, the lazy presumptions that people make in this area.
Sort of taking a slightly more kind of meta perspective, how do you think we've ended up in this place? There's a thinker called Jordan Greenhall who we've had on the channel a couple of times, and he talks about how the left has kind of started from the values of openness, but it kind of degenerated into a kind of ideology of openness. So that there are certain topics that you have to have a certain view on that sound open, but are actually now pretty much binary ideological frames. What do you think's happened to this conversation to lead us to where we're at?
That's a very deep question, and I don't exactly know the answer. I can't exactly trace how we got here, but I think people are insufficiently alive to the power of ideas to grip people and to grip entire populations. So I don't see that there needs to be an explanation deeper than people have made arguments that have penetrated other people's minds. I think there was a moment in the 60s in this country where we were wrestling between the colorblind vision and the color conscious vision. And colorblindness was written right into the laws. The way JFK and Lyndon Johnson talked about affirmative action was explicitly colorblind. The way Martin Luther King talked about race, the way Bayard Rustin talked about race. They had a big picture humanist vision of the world. And then just in a few years, it seems like the war of ideas was basically won by the Black Power movement, the Black Panthers, by that contingent of people who were far more race conscious. They didn't want black people to downplay their quote unquote blackness. They wanted to hold white people's feet to the fire. They wanted them to feel that they were white and know what that meant. And that war of ideas has been more or less a consensus since then. The winning side of that idea has continued winning, I think, and it's ebbed and flowed. And it was certainly it was exacerbated starting right around 2014, when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, and when we all had iPhones and Facebook to see evidence of that, and to have very unproductive and scary debates about it on social media. So just since 2014, there's been a spike in intensity around this issue, and it's magnified the conflict. But the conflict has been there for decades. So I would say the power of ideas is sufficient to explain why we're here. In addition to that, I would add that social media and the current access to videos of unarmed black people getting killed by the cops, in isolation of the fact that in any given year more white people are killed by the cops than blacks, the visceralness of seeing those videos rather than reading it in the newspaper as you would have in 2007 has magnified what the conflict of ideas that has existed for decades.
Just moving on a little bit to, so there's a sort of sense at the moment that there is an emerging kind of alternative media at the same time as the kind of mainstream media feels a little bit more ideologically captured. What do you make of, there was a Quillette piece recently that basically said that this attitude to the social justice left, either for or anti, is becoming the main wedge issue now between, I don't think you can really call it left and right, but you can certainly call it kind of a new constellation. What do you make of that? Do you think that that's a reasonable argument?
On its face, I think that if that's true, then that says something flattering about the left's ability to eject people from it. Because, interrogate what that argument means. What it means is that SJWs sprang up right around 2014. Yes, they existed before, but that was the year where it kind of started becoming a national story that SJWs were infiltrating journalism, and you were just seeing more of these outbreaks. You were seeing things happen on campus that a few years earlier you would have just laughed off, and now it's a Yale professor is leaving campus over a Halloween costume. That's when that started happening. And the idea is that 5 years later, the main or one of the main political fault lines is whether you're pro or anti SJWs. It's sort of the Vox versus Quillette standoff. What that tells me is that a lot of people on the left didn't like SJWs and got booted out of the left, which then made it the case that the new fault line was pro and anti SJW, whereas before you could have a pro or anti SJW view and be on the left. It also could be a story of anti-SJW people on the left choosing to move more towards the right. There's agency involved as well. So I don't really think in those terms, but it's definitely a fault line, whether you're kind of into social justice ideology or not. That's definitely an important political fault line, one of the most important. I don't know exactly how it tracks with left and right, because left and right are kind of by definition moving targets, and no one person gets to decide what they mean, and I don't really know what they mean right now in 2019. So I'm not gonna comment on whether the pro and anti SJW divide mirrors the left and the right at this point, because people can argue. It just gets semantic when we talk about what does it mean to be a leftist or a right winger.
How do you think it's possible to reach people who are maybe just ideologically captured or just have bad ideas without making them into enemies?
I don't know that there's a one-size-fits-all strategy. And I do know that there's no strategy that avoids completely the phenomenon of making enemies. So there are many people, no matter what I said, no matter what evidence I provided that I was coming from a good place, I could save 10 puppies from a burning building, risking my own life, and they would still think I'm an Uncle Tom and a sellout. Which is not to say that saving puppies is clear evidence that you're not a sellout, but you get my point. And I'm fine with that. You have to reconcile yourself to the fact that not everyone in life is going to like you. That's kind of an insane thing to expect. Nor should you use that as a reason to write off people who are passionate and disagree with you, because people get persuaded out of entire worldviews all the time. They just generally do it quietly. So we get the sense that everyone is unpersuadable because the unpersuadable people are advertising their unpersuadability very loudly on Twitter. Twitter and Facebook and writing in general selects for a kind of stubborn personality. And often what has happened is that the writer you're seeing now, right in 2016, being all stubborn, is someone who had a profound change of worldview 5 years ago, very quietly, brought on by some other writer. So I'm not cynical or I'm not pessimistic about the prospect of changing people's minds. But again, I don't think there's any silver bullet or strategy other than just trying to make sense, trying to state other people's arguments accurately, and then giving your reasons why you have a different perspective.
And you've been sort of lumped in with the IDW, the intellectual dark web. And one of the criticisms of the IDW is that it's reactionary. How would you, if someone accused you of being reactionary, how would you address that? What would you say to that?
Yeah, I guess reactionary and contrarian are two words that confuse me, because sometimes I'll be, because is the idea that I shouldn't disagree with anything, or that I shouldn't disagree with something a lot of people disagree with? Is the idea that reacting to things is bad? Well, not really. What they're accusing you of with those words are either being contrarian for the sake of being contrarian, which is to say not being oriented towards truth, but being oriented towards whatever you view as the counter-narrative. To that charge, there are all kinds of, if I were a contrarian, which is to say someone who got off to contrary beliefs just for their own sake, I would be leaving a lot of happiness points on the table by acknowledging the mainstream scientific account of climate change, by not trafficking in conspiracy theories. It seems like I'd be kind of just giving up all of these potential mental
You're saying you're doing it quite badly if
Yes.
you want to be a contrarian.
Yes. From my point of view, I'm contrary to and reacting to ways of thinking that are deeply unreasonable. And I see no problem with reacting to unreasonable things, because what is one supposed to do? Not react to them? So I guess to the broader question of whether the IDW is reactionary, I don't know that I have a very intelligent opinion on that, because the IDW encompasses lots of very different personality types. Sam Harris doesn't strike me as reactionary. Is Ben Shapiro reactionary? Maybe more than Sam Harris, in the sense that I'm more likely to see him react to things on Twitter more frequently. But I'm not. But here's the thing, like I just said before, Ben Shapiro's style of argument persuades a lot of people. They just get persuaded silently and not in view. So the kind of fast talking, making a million points a minute, rarely giving an inch, the Ben Shapiro brand, while it seems very strident and mean to some people, it also is very persuasive and effective. And on the things that Ben Shapiro is right about, I think that's all to the good. Sam Harris has a very different style. Jordan Peterson has a different style still. And different kinds of minds get persuaded by different kinds of styles. One certainly wants whatever the IDW is, one wants that to be elevating the conversation, as you said, rather than denigrating it. One wants it to be a force that is bringing people together rather than tearing them apart, or rather than contributing to the polarization that it's diagnosing as a problem.
I mean, as you just said, that the idea is to try and elevate the conversation rather than add to the polarization. How do we do that? How does anyone do that?
Well, I guess it starts with yourself. You can surround yourself with voices that you don't always agree with, but take those voices seriously and be willing to be persuaded on things. Follow people on Twitter who you agree with on one issue but don't on another. Read the articles that they share. Talk to people face to face about difficult issues. Try to notice the tendency in yourself to overreact to things, to click on the links that seemed perfectly designed to piss you off. Be charitable to your enemies, which is to say, assume that they're not crazy and that they're probably right. They're probably not wrong about everything they think. Yeah, other than that, it seems like there has to be some systemic solutions. It can't be all of us bootstrapping our way out of polarization. There has to be something to do on Facebook and Twitter, in schools, or elsewhere to fix things at a systemic level in addition to individuals making personal changes.
And you said before that it's important to be kind of careful with language around this. What do you make of Candace Owens' language around this? Because she's very, very polarizing and has said some quite kind of provocative things around race.
Yeah, I think she is very unserious in the sense that, you know, I've seen her say things without any evidence of her feeling a burden to back it up with a fact. You know, like Richard Spencer is a Democratic plant. When challenged on Joe Rogan about why she thinks climate change isn't real, she doesn't even have a single study to back it up. She's not a smart climate skeptic, or it's just her gut feeling against the view that she thinks is wrong. And when asked to back it up, often has nothing. The Southern strategy never happened. That if you're going to argue that, you better know something that mainstream historians don't. But she seems to feel no burden to back those opinions up with evidence, which is my first problem. My second problem is that she seems to have very little respect for civil discourse and free speech. She tweeted that, you know, Hillary, Mueller, and Bezos should all be locked up. She tweeted that, right? Okay. Is that someone who's serious about civil discourse, or someone who likes seeing their enemies thrown in jail? Or someone who's performing? I actually can't tell. I'm willing to believe that most people are nice people. But many nice people are also constitutionally incapable of really charitable civil discourse, kind of bullies, and they enjoy bullying. And Candace gives me that sense, in addition to being someone who is comfortable making factually inaccurate claims and just kind of letting them sit there.
Because there's also this sort of sense that in the current kind of expansion of the culture war, someone like her, a black conservative, is of a huge value to one side in that culture war. Like there's this sort of sense of huge forces pulling people towards more extreme positions.
I'm sure that the incentives of social media, anything based on an ad model, is you're getting paid by the click. So all the incentives are aligned to cater to your outrage, to show you things that you either hate or love, which is going to show you ever more shallow versions of the opinions you disagree with, and ever more moralizing and extreme versions of the opinions you do agree with. Whether that explains Candace Owens's beliefs is something I can't know and don't particularly care about. Again, I don't really care how she came to her belief that Richard Spencer was a Democratic plant. I don't care how she came to the belief that women who don't have children have something biochemically wrong with them, as she put it. The former is a conspiracy theory, and the latter is just a bullying thing to say. It's just mean, and it's not interesting. So, my critique of her has nothing to do with who she's funded by, because, again, you could be funded by someone and still happen to be right. You could be funded by the Koch brothers and have correct opinions, just like you can be funded by George Soros and have correct opinions or incorrect opinions. So, my problem with her is the way she thinks. Ironically, Kanye famously tweeted, "I love the way Candace Owens thinks," but it's precisely the way she thinks that's the problem, which is to say there are many things that I agree with her on. Her general critique of the left on race issues is often spot on, but it's the way she thinks that's the problem, because it's often not evidence-based at all, which leads her to say these things that are patently false. And, it actually amazes me. Sometimes I forget how big a platform she has, because just when I see a clip of her and how shallow it is, I assume that she doesn't have that big of a following. But then every once in a while, I'm reminded of her Twitter followership, and I'm surprised every time.
You're increasingly in a really influential position and speaking on some of the hottest topics. How do you make sure that you are keeping your own mind open and being exposed to critiques and being having the intellectual curiosity and intellectual honesty to challenge your own views and perspectives? Do you think that's a really important thing for you to do? And if so,
yeah.
how
I think
do you do
one
it?
thing I'm very afraid of is if I ever became, I guess there's this thing when somehow as the number of Twitter followers you have goes up, people's willingness to challenge you on your beliefs in private sometimes goes down, which doesn't make sense and is really concerning. So I can imagine someone who has 1 million Twitter followers, who is a legend, and who surrounds themselves by people who praise them constantly, and they lose their edge to the point where when they're confronted by someone who really knows the topic and challenges them, they're left completely, their cards are shown, and they realize, holy crap, I've just been surrounded by people who are smelling my farts and not challenging me at all. I think that's happened to a lot of people.
How do you avoid smelling your farts?
Well, I'm not big enough to have a posse of people who agree with me, and that also sounds like horrible. That sounds like a nightmare. I would much rather have people, which I do, who disagree with me all the time. So I seek out those interactions. I have friends who think I'm wrong about big parts of the way I assess race issues, and I talk to those friends. So I get that pushback. I read opinions I disagree with frequently. I tried to steel man my opponents. All of these things. Try to stay mentally flexible and mentally healthy. Understand that you can change your opinion on something and it's not the end of the world. You can admit to being wrong and it's not the end of the world. So, yeah, I'm not super concerned about it, but I do think about it.
And where do you think this wider conversation needs to go next? Do you have a sense of where the kind of resolution on the other side of the culture wars is?
No.
I guess what I was kind of alluding to there was something you said in the conversation with Sam about that you hoped that these race issues would become less charged in the future.
Oh, I do, yeah. If black people became less and less attached to historical victimhood, if we taught slavery and Jim Crow without internalizing those aspects of American history, without drawing a straight line from how black people were oppressed to what policies we should enact and how we should interact with other human beings in a personal way, if we stopped buying this delusion that your skin color is injected with meaning by history, then yeah, that would go a long way towards ending this particular aspect of the culture war. But there's something circular about that. It's like saying if this part of the culture war ended, then it'll end. The question is whether it will, how it will. I'm not super optimistic about that right now. But it's possible we hit peak race craziness around now and we're on the decline. But, you know, on some level we're still having the debate that we were having in the late 60s, which is concerning because we live in a very different world. Which once again doesn't make me optimistic about the likelihood of us still having this debate when I'm my grandfather's age. Although so much will change by then that it could really be unrecognizable, but it's impossible to say.
Coleman, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.